Welcome, and thank you for joining us for our Chats on the Past program, where the museum discusses history with scholars, authors, historians, and artisans. My name is Claire Menard, and I am the programs manager here at the Westport Museum for History and Culture. The museum is pleased to offer free programming. We do have a donation link if you are so inclined. We understand that this is a challenging time for many, and any support you can offer in the museum is greatly appreciated. During our program, if you have any questions, please enter them in the comments box. We will go through appropriate comments and questions at the end of our discussion. We are joined today by Dr. Katrina Phillips. Dr. Phillips is a citizen of the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe, and is an associate professor of American Indian History at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. Dr. Phillips is the author of Staging Indigeneity, Salvage Tourism, and the Performance of Native American History. Staging Indigeneity delves into the history of Native American stories as told and performed from a white perspective in what she deems salvage tourism. Dr. Phillips, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. Great. So I just want to get started kind of with some background on you. Specifically, how did you get interested in history?
So it's always a question I love to answer because it's like I always loved history. Like when I was in, this is like really diving into the depths of who I am as a human. But in like fifth grade or something like that, some friends and I decided we were going to write a book on like the presidents. And so we all divvied up like, all the presidents. And again, this was before like internet because it's like the 90s. And so it was like going to the library, writing up all these little things. My friends kind of quit after they each did like one or two. And then I like finished it because I was like, well, we started it. Now we have to finish it. Um, and so, like, I've always loved books, I've always loved history, but I honestly didn't know that it was, like, something you could do for a living. And so I'm from very rural northern Wisconsin, and so it just never seemed nobody was ever like, "Hey, did you know that, like, you could be a historian, you could be a professor, you can take what you love to do and then do it for a living." And so it wasn't until I got to college at the University of Minnesota and started taking history classes alongside, dance, theater, music classes. And I was like, wait a minute, like this is a thing, this is a career. And so I ended up becoming a history major. I then went to grad school and got a PhD in history. I started teaching at Macalester, and so far, that's kinda all she wrote.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. So, while researching your book, what kind of sites and institutions did you go to, and what kind of sources were you primarily working with?
So and again, sorry, that's such a great question because there are kind of 2 separate answers to that. And so the book looks at 3 different productions, that use Native history as the basis for their scripts. And so one is the Happy Canyon Indian Pageant and Wild West Show, which they've done in Pendleton, Oregon since the 1910s. And it's done in conjunction with the Pendleton Roundup, like a big rodeo out there. Another one is Unto These Hills, which they've done in Cherokee, North Carolina since the 1950s. And then the last one is Tecumseh, which has been staged in Chillicothe, Ohio since the 1970s. And so I've seen all of these shows, uh, most of them more than once, and actually all of them more than once now that I stop and think about it. Um, and so that was kind of my first introduction to it. And with Tecumseh in particular, the one that's in Chillicothe, Ohio, I didn't do any research ahead of time. I was like, I want to be as much of an audience participant as I can. And so going into it, I I probably should have known more about who Tecumseh was based on what I do for a living, but I was like, I'm not going to read any books or articles or anything like that. I'm going to be a tourist. And so, uh, a, one chapter for each of the productions is kind of my experiences of being there, what it's like to see these shows, to be in these towns, to be in these cities, and things like that. Um, and a lot of the primary source material came from the archives of the Institute of Outdoor Drama, which is now the Institute of Outdoor Theater. And those archives are housed, oddly enough, at East Carolina University. And so I spent a lot of time in the archives there, but it was also kind of finding archives wherever I could go. And so in Pendleton, I went to the Happy Canyon, or it's the Pendleton Roundup and Happy Canyon Hall of Fame. And so it's a museum. And I found a woman who looked like she knew what she was talking about. And I kind of introduced myself and said, I'm trying to find any sources here. Are there any that you can recommend? And she goes, "Oh yeah, come here, come with me." And so she takes me to this little spot. And like in houses and buildings where it's like you have stairs going up or down, and then there's that little like tucked under space, right? That's like kind of useless. And so she pulls this curtain back, and it's like stacks and stacks and stacks of old programs from the rodeo and the pageant. And she was like, "Take what you want." And so and so I did. And in in Cherokee, it was going into the records at the Museum of the Cherokee Indian. And then in Chillicothe, it was going into the Ross County Historical Society. And so it was honestly a lot of fun to get a chance to just see all these different places, and the tiny little historical societies that are just like so excited that somebody wants to look at their materials and to see what they have. And so yeah, it was honestly, it was really great. And I mean, God bless the archivists at East Carolina University who pulled box after box after box of things for me when I was there for my research trips. And so yeah, it was a lot of fun. And getting the chance to look at old letters and photographs and all of these different forms of correspondence, and reading the scripts and being able to pull what seems like really disparate sources together in order to create what I hope is like a coherent narrative throughout the book.
Oh, yeah. We are a fairly small museum ourselves, and one of our favorite things is whenever people come in, particularly when they have a very niche interest and they say, "Can you pull boxes on this?" We're like, "Of course we can. This is literally what we do. Please come in." So, it's always great to have people come in and show interest in the history. Um, so one question some of our viewers might be having is, one phrase you use a lot and even in the title of your book is salvage tourism. So could you perhaps give us a definition of salvage tourism and how you came up with that term?
Sure. And so the answer, I can kind of answer both of those questions at the same time. And so I was sitting in my graduate advisor's office, and we were talking about one of the chapters I had written. Maybe it was the introduction. I can't even remember like what we were honed in on. And I was like, I just can't get over the fact that these productions exist. I was like, it's basically like it takes, salvage anthropology, salvage ethnography, right? And so, and the roots of salvage anthropology and salvage ethnography are coming out of the late 19th, early 20th century, when the prevailing opinion is that Native people are inevitably going to disappear. And so you have all of these scholars who go out across the country and try to literally salvage whatever they can, whether it's recording songs, whether it's recording dances, whether it's recording stories, things like that, not for the purposes of the Native nations themselves, but for the government, for scholars, and then for the scholars who will follow them. And so, I'm talking with my advisor, and I was like, it's so strange to me because it's like salvage anthropology, only it's tourism. And it was almost at the same time we were like, it's salvage tourism. And we stopped, and my advisor was like, okay, now you have to define what this is. And so I did a lot of work and spent a lot it sounds so silly to say it now, but it's like I spent a lot of time thinking about it. But when, in academia, when you kind of like coin a term, you're kind of on the hook for what is it? What is it not? And so the best way that I can describe it, and I can probably find a better way at some point in time, but thinking about those two pieces put together, right? And so it's the salvaging part of it, right? Where it's like frantically pulling together all of these little pieces of what people consider to be authentic indigeneity, but doing so in a manner that's specifically for tourists. And so one of the questions I get a lot is, okay, so is this cultural tourism? Is it heritage tourism? And the answer is no. It's not either one of those. And the reason it's not either one of those is because cultural tourism, heritage tourism, things like that, those are both very grounded in authenticity. And so with salvage tourism, it is very grounded in what people want to be authentic, what tourists want to see as authentic, even though for the Native people whose histories and stories and narratives are included in it, it's not authentic to them. I found this on the And so that to me is one of the biggest kind of differences there as to what makes productions like this salvage tourism as opposed to heritage tourism or cultural tourism.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you just kinda have a eureka moment and you're like, "Oh my gosh, I have this new thing, I must tell everybody," and I think that's fantastic. Um, so in a, previous conversation we had, while you were actually writing the book, you mentioned, while going to these, performances that you, hid your identity as a Native woman and passed as white, while attending them, just kind of as a precaution. Were there times where you felt you were in a hostile situation where hiding your Indianness really was essential?
So with it was really interesting, and particularly and I mean, quite honestly, if I didn't have these earrings, like if I wasn't wearing like the earrings from my grandma right now, um I'm pretty like ethnically ambiguous, where people are like, okay, what are you? And so in some instances it helps. And so what the moment that really struck me was when I went to the first trip I took to go see Unto These Hills, and I had gotten a ride there with the director. I had been backstage, talking with cast members and crew members and things like that. And I went to kind of scope out where my seat was because I'm a theater nerd. I had to make sure I had like the right seat to be able to watch the show. Um, and this surely well-meaning woman um, came up to me and handed me her tickets and said, Can you tell us where our seats are?" And it took me a minute, and I was like, she thinks I work here because it's on the reservation. A lot of the people who work there are native and things like that. And so that was a moment where I was like, I am seeing these productions differently than other people are seeing them, not just because I'm an academic, but because of who I am. Um, and when I went to Pendleton, one of the times I went there to go see, Happy Canyon and things like that. And I read about this in the book too. And so, in order to be able to take pictures, I had to get press credentials. And so, go over to the press trailer, which is literally like an old trailer. And I said, I told them who I was, what I was hoping to do, what did I need to do to be credentialed. And it's part of since the Pendleton Roundup is like a real big time rodeo, they actually have dress requirements for anybody who wants press credentials. And so the requirements are a Western shirt, cowboy boots, and a cowboy hat. And I had jeans, and I was like, cool. I had jeans and I had my cowboy boots. And the cowboy boots I actually bought in from a secondhand store in Cheyenne, Wyoming for a friend's wedding. And I was like, okay, check and check. And then I was like, I need a shirt and I need a hat. And so I literally went out and found like a street side vendor and bought a cowboy shirt and a cowboy hat. And I, put it all on and I'm like, I look ridiculous. Some girls look super cute in like the cowboy hat. I look like I'm trying too hard. I can't help it. It's part of who I am. And so I go back in the trailer, like, here I am. Can I have the press credentials? And this older gentleman just kind of like looked me up and down, and he was like, we all have a part to play in Pendleton, and like handed me the pass. And yeah, it was really interesting, and it was really hot while I was there, which is another reason I was like, okay, I'm in long sleeves, I'm in long pants. I hate this. And I didn't know what to do with my hair because I've got a lot of hair. And so I just put it in braids. And that was what threw people for a loop, was because I looked like a Native woman, because I am, but I was dressed like a cowgirl. And so the kind of like cognitive dissonance that I discovered there was really striking, which is strange because there are a lot of Native folks who participate in rodeos. There are a lot of Native folks whose families are, they're ranchers, right? Um, but that was a moment where it became very hard to hide who I was because of how I was dressed. And it seems like such a small thing, particularly as, but again, like as someone who studies performance, walking down the street in Pendleton dressed like a cowgirl was a performance for me. And so it really kind of shaped how I studied these productions and how I studied the environments in which they occur.
Yeah, I think a lot of people kind of like to pretend that your identity is something you can just put aside at times, but no, it's literally a part of who you are and you cannot hide it, especially when you have certain features that it's like, you put on the braids and suddenly everything clicked and everyone's like, "Oh, that's a Native woman." So, yeah, people realize that it's a lived experience 24/7. It's not just something you can take on and take off at certain times. So you mentioned, Pendleton definitely being a big production to the point where there was a dress code for the press. So what is the economy of salvage tourism like? So obviously tourism is meant to draw in people and therefore money, but do these performances still draw in income, or are they done more so for tradition at this point?
That's a fantastic question, and every production is different. And so in Pendleton, the roundup, and so Happy Canyon is kind of like a side part of the roundup. And so the roundup happens during the day in the big arena, and then Happy Canyon is like the nighttime entertainment. And that's actually why it was started in the first place, is because They had all these people come to town for the rodeo, and there wasn't anything for folks to do at night. But the roundup, which includes Happy Canyon, is one of the biggest sources of revenue for the city and for the state as a whole. And so it is a massive rodeo. It is honestly, I mean, going to the rodeo during the day was one of the coolest things I've ever gotten to do. And just to see, and yet like it's kind of a thing that we've done with, my dad for a lot of years is, going to rodeos and things like that. And so being in Pendleton during Roundup Week, and I've never gone to Pendleton except for Roundup Week, but I mean, you have to walk for blocks and blocks and blocks if you park your car somewhere because all of the streets are filled with vendors and all of the bars and restaurants have their doors wide open. They've got, the signs outside. I mean, they had the chalkboard signs out on the side of the road like before it was cool. And so, and it's just there are so many people, right? And that's part of the atmosphere. That's part of what makes it Roundup Week. And so in a place like Pendleton, the Roundup and Happy Canyon combined is really a huge driving factor of the economy. Um, but in other places, like in Cherokee with Under These Hills, it's not such a huge part of the economy anymore. And a big reason for that is because of the casino. There's a Harrah's casino in Cherokee now. And the last time I was there, they were doing this like massive expansion of it. And I mean, it was huge when I was there. I cannot imagine what it's like now. Like when I went there, the woman at the front desk like gave took out this big map and was like, "Okay, we're here. Here's how you get to your room." Like drew on it, and I'm like, "Okay, I can find my way around a hotel." But I like took the map. It was after like 10 minutes, I was like, "Okay, I quit." And I had to pull out the map she gave me. And so and so obviously the casino now is much more of a driving factor as far as the economy goes. And so there's not really the same kind of pressure on onto these hills as there used to be. And it's still a big part of, the summer tourism season. It runs for a couple months throughout the summer, but it has been kind of, upstaged, overtaken, whatever word you want to use. Um, but that doesn't mean that it is like irrelevant, right? It's just not the economic factor it used to be. Then with Tecumseh, which is the one in Ohio, and so Chillicothe is fairly south in Ohio, and with with that production, so Tecumseh is staged kind of like Unto These Hills, so it's throughout the summer. They do I don't know 5 6 performances of it a week, but the folks who run Tecumseh are trying their best to keep kind of boosting up the economy. And so they'll host, um, like movie nights, they'll host these other events and things like that to try to keep it going and uphold it. Um, it has admittedly been a little while since I've checked kind of the economic impact of the Tecumseh production, but in a lot of these places, not only these three, but the cities and towns across the nation that have staged productions like this over the years. And this is something I've actually gotten kind of knocked for, criticized for a little bit in some of the book reviews that have come out is, my fellow scholars have been like, there's not really a strong takedown of these productions and the people behind them. And this might be a cop out, but for me, one of the biggest things about tourism, and this is what Hal Rothman called tourism, he called it the last resort. And so when you have these cities, towns, regions, what have you, that no longer have much of anything, right? Maybe they are former industrial towns, maybe they are really rural, right? When there's nothing or when there's very little left, that's when people turn to tourism. And so while I have a number of issues with the scripts for each of these shows, at the same time, it's really hard to kind of condemn people for turning to tourism as a way to keep their cities alive. So,
Yeah, I think a lot of people want to treat issues in black and white, and as many academics and scholars have learned throughout the research, is it's almost never the case. It's You can almost never say this person was entirely good or entirely evil. So it's good, I think, that you understand where these people are at least coming from, even if what they're doing can be harmful in a way. And speaking of it being harmful, perfect tie into my next question. Um, so as you mentioned, a lot of these performances still, even if they're not as popular as they used to be, they still have some attendance. They still go on. People seem to have a passion for them. Did you find that these performances were having a real impact on how both locals and tourists alike view the history of Native peoples and nations portrayed? Like, for example, Tecumseh. Are they mere entertainment, or are they doing real harm to actual historical events?
so God, these are such great questions, Claire. Uh, um, and yeah, and I think that's one of the things I kind of wrestled with in the book, and with Pendleton. I mean, the pageant is staged like 15 minutes from a reservation, and it's very much a narrative of indigenous decline and erasure. But at the same time, you have the descendants of, the Cayuse, the Umatilla, the Walla Walla, who were forced to cede like 6.5 million acres of their land in 1855. The descendants of those people are the ones who are appearing in the pageant. And so there's a really weird tension there between the history we see and then the people who are performing it. And a number of the people I talked to when I was out there brought that up and would tell me stories about things that happened in the region that aren't in the script. And their participation isn't necessarily like a tacit acceptance of it. For them, it seems like it's just become more of a reason, a rationale to come home and to connect with friends and family and things like that. Um, the way that it's done in Unto These Hills is also really interesting. And again, with that one there, the casting there for a long time was did not include very many Native people, or if it did, at least the leading parts where it's the characters actually have names. They're not just like ensemble. A lot of those parts didn't weren't played by Native actors, and but now it's kind of becoming. There are a lot more Eastern Band of Cherokee people who are in the cast, a lot more Native people as a whole, and things like that. The one that is probably the most, if I were to say dangerous, it would be Tecumseh. And Tecumseh is the production that I wrestled with the most when I was writing this book. And the reason it's so like it takes a while to kind of wrap your head around it is because Tecumseh's mission was to stop American expansion. And he died fighting for that cause and sided with the British in order to stop, again, American expansion in the War of 1812. And a person like that is kind of hard to make into an American hero. And so it was really interesting to see the way the production quite literally twists history in order to make this a narrative that is celebratory and one that people want to see. And that's also something I struggled with a lot when I was writing this, is because by and large it's really hard to find those like celebratory narratives in native history. But if you're staging a show like this, you want people to come and see it. And so it's, yeah, and I think that's why I find these productions so fascinating, is because how on one hand, right, these shows are meant to be entertainment, right? They're supposed to be entertaining, they're supposed to be, you know, not fun in a sense, right? But you're supposed to go and be like wowed by the battles and, impressed by the dances and things like that. But in order to make it a show that people want to see, because what's the point of staging a production that nobody wants to see, is how do you tell how do you tell what happened and still have that entertainment value?
Yeah. So you kind of touched on this already in the answer you just gave. But did you encounter a lot of Native American participation in these performances? And if so, what were their thoughts on the way Native history, whether their own or of another nation's, was being portrayed?
So the easy answer with that one is Tecumseh, is because there have maybe been two or three native actors in the history of the production, and they've all been men who played Tecumseh. None of them have been Shawnee, and so that one's easy to set aside. And so with Happy Canyon and with Unto These Hills, uh, that's where that's where I met and saw the most native participants. And with, like I said, with Unto These Hills, now there are more Eastern Band participants. There are more native actors who are in the show, and it was really interesting to get a chance to talk with them. And I mean, for a lot of folks, it's a chance to be part of this retelling of their history. And for some people, it's might be more of a paycheck. And the one that was, and it's kind of interesting now thinking about the questions you're asking. With a lot of them, it's like each one has its own thing that I really had to wrestle with, but it's not the same for each one. And so, getting a chance to talk with folks who participate in Happy Canyon, that was for me kind of one of the most eye-opening things I got to do. And I am honored and humbled that people took the time to talk with me and have these conversations. Especially because if you'll remember, this is when I was walking around like in a cowboy hat and a Western shirt. Um, but it was really interesting because folks that were, kind of my age, younger than that, like teenagers, early 20s, um, they were they were super excited to be there. These are the people. I almost said kids. They're not kids. But these are the folks that are learning the language and teaching the language and making beadwork and doing all of these things that for them just seems like what you do. And talking to the people who are, closer to like my parents' age and things like that, grandparents' age, those are the people. And again, that's not to say that people my age and younger don't face discrimination because it's pretty unfortunately, it's pretty obvious that that still happens. But those are the people, our parents and our grandparents, those are the ones who dealt with it the most. And for them, their participation transcends the narrative that's in the production. And when I say that, I mean they know what's not in the script. They understand that this is a very particular narrative that's meant to be deliberately capitalizing on the tragic nature of this history. And so it took me a long time to kind of figure out how to reconcile that and try to put those different interpretations of one show together. But yeah, it was really interesting in all three places to see people's reactions to it, particularly the people who were performing in it. There was a time when I thought about like interviewing people who were going to see the shows as to why they were going and all this stuff. And I'm like, maybe I could do that, but their story isn't really the one I want to tell, right? I want it to be the people who are participating in these productions and trying to get at the heart of that history and that rationale behind it.
Yeah, I think I'd be more surprised if there was one consensus. That almost never happens, you know? Um, so there was definitely, as you said, some Native participation, but from what I've gathered from reading the book and previous questions, it was a lot of white actors in particular. And I want to touch upon this phenomenon that you may have heard of called Cherokee Princess Syndrome. It's especially in this day and age, we like to not, we don't want to assume someone's ethnicity based on how they look externally, especially with issues like blood quantum that have been around for so long. But there is kind of an issue with a lot of white people will say they have Native American heritage when they don't, even if they do have a little bit, they don't have any direct cultural ties. And the joke phrase is, my grandmother was a Cherokee princess. So did you ever encounter any actors who you felt were kind of pulling that, my grandmother was a Cherokee princess line in terms of their acting as a Native person in a play?
So thankfully, no. It was, but again, there was a lot of it was really strange, particularly with Tecumseh, because the Shawnee were forcibly removed from what's now Ohio, Indiana, and that's the production that is produced the farthest away from where that nation currently lives. And so Unto These Hills is on the Eastern Band. It's on the Koala boundary. It's the homelands of the Eastern Band. And like I said, the Happy Canyon is, I looked it up, it's like 6 miles maybe from the reservation. And for Tecumseh, that's the one where I saw the most of what Phil Deloria calls playing Indian. And that that was a very strange, it was like a jolt to see that show for the first time. And it's one of those things where there are so many stereotypes and myths and all of these different components wrapped up in what folks think Native people should look like, how they should act, and things like that. And so I didn't see anybody who was, trying to capitalize on the Cherokee princess kind of mythos, right? But it's really strange to see actors in what I call like the Disney Pocahontas shade, right? Like I've never met a person who is that color, and then when you see actors who are purposely painted that color, that's when it was really kind of like a shock to the system in a sense.
So they were actually intentionally darkening their skin.
Hmm.
Great. That's a yeah, well, I think most people nowadays know why that's not a good thing to do,
I hope
but,
so.
I mean, not all of them. So, with these issues in mind, do you think that there is any way to kind of reconstruct, or should I say salvage tourism performances, and, can they be reconstructed to be told from a Native perspective, do you think?
That is something I have thought about more times than I care to admit as I was doing the research for this book. And the best examples are actually Unto These Hills and Happy Canyon. And I mean, quite honestly, I think the answer is no, because if you tell these stories the way they should be told, nobody's going to go see them. And with Happy Canyon, there was a period of time where they tried to change the whole structure of the show. Giving people speaking lines, adding all of these different things, and the people who participated were like, "Nope, that is not how this show is done." And they've kept a couple things of it. So it used to be very much, and so that's the one that premiered in the 1910s, and so it's done very much in the style of like the old school like tableau, like tableau vivant and things like that, where it's people they're miming, they're moving about on the stage, but they don't have speaking lines. And so one thing that they've kept is kind of this narration piece to it, where it's like one person is talking about what's happening, and then you have the scene that follows. So that's one that they've kept a little bit of the changes they tried to make. Unto These Hills is fascinating in that regard because it premiered in 1950, and that script is the one that was performed up through 2005. And then it was, I can't remember, 2, 3, 4 different variations that they tried over the years, and it didn't work. Audiences didn't like it. The people who were in the performances didn't really like it. It was reflected in the ticket sales. That I mean, the response was pretty overwhelmingly negative. And so a couple of years ago, this would have been before COVID, so maybe 2017 or 2018, something like that. I have the right year in my book. I just haven't looked at that section in a while. They went back to the original and changed a couple things, but by and large, they went back to the script that was first done in 1950. And that was when I was like, well, time to go back to Cherokee. um, but I mean, I think that's a really powerful example of the power of tourism, right? And they've never tried change to drastically change Tecumseh, because if they do, I don't know that the production would survive.
Yeah, it's this balancing really of wanting to tell a more correct narrative, but one that people actually go out to see. People have this idea of manifest destiny and the West and, Indians and cowboys, and the second that's challenged, people just kind of shut down, which is not great. Before we move on to the next question, I just want to really quick remind the audience that our live viewers, if you have any questions, feel free to comment them at any time, and we will go over them towards the end of the interview. So, up next, I wanted to talk about this concept of cultural appropriation versus appreciation, which is a very hot topic in the US and has been for quite some time, I say. So, can you give us some examples, if any exist, of times you felt that you were witnessing cultural appreciation and times you felt you were witnessing cultural appropriation?
Oh man. I think this is such an academic answer, an academic way around having to actually have an answer. Um, I think I think for most of these productions, they are staging what they feel is appreciation. Um, but again, as someone who has a background in performance, has a, you know, this is probably the time where I have to admit that my first choice of career was not history; it was being on Broadway. And so having seen countless musicals, many of them more than once, much to the chagrin of my husband, um, it's it's so I just find theater so incredibly fascinating, and I know that's a word that I keep using, but in order to put something on stage, it has to be exciting. It has to make audiences either like, jump back in awe or like move to the edge of their seats. And I think with a lot of what I see in these productions, particularly when they're evoking native dances and things like that, is probably straddling a very fine line between appreciation and appropriation. And there are a couple dances um, in each one where that line gets really blurry. And again, is it because it's that grand picture that you see on the stage, right? Versus what would this dance actually look like in practice as opposed to in performance?
Yeah, it is a tough topic to discuss because there is no general consensus amongst any group really of what constitutes appreciation versus appropriation. So it is, at least at this point, a fairly subjective matter. So, and like you said, touting the line happens a lot. Some people will find a dance like that and say, I'm not comfortable with white people doing this dance, and other people see the dance and say, I think it's great that my culture is being shown. So it's really up to the person how they feel. So let's talk about historical accuracy, one of our favorite things. Um, would you say, I think I know the answer to this one. Would you say these performances were as accurate as they could be to the cultures they intended to represent, or were they depicting a more kind of pan-Indian, generic, or even stereotypical idea of Native Americans?
Oh, you do know the answer to that question. Um, and so it's not to say I need to kind of flesh that out a little bit. And so with these productions, particularly with Happy Canyon and Unto These Hills, by and large, the narrative is truthful. But there's a difference between truth and omission. And with Happy Canyon, the native portion of the production ends with this post Treaty of 1855 signing. And you see, and so every native participant in the show moves across the stage walks across the stage or rides across the stage from the audience's right to their left. And so regardless of your orientation where you're sitting, it is meant to evoke westward movement, forced removal westward. And it is one of the most powerful, like, theatrical scenes I've ever seen. And the juxtaposition into the next part of the show is also a really big jolt because it's the native portion of the show, and then the second half is this kind of like slapstick vaudeville, like frontier town production. And there's one spot in that production where, in the second half, where a native person comes on from stage right, so the audience is left, and is supposed to like trade a saddle or something like that. Um, but one of the nights I was there, I saw this person kind of ride on. They kind of like did a circle and then they left. And I asked somebody about it later, and they were like, "Oh, they're supposed to have a saddle, but we didn't have one." And I'm like, "We are at the Pendleton Roundup. There are lots of saddles everywhere." And so it's so interesting to me how hard it is for productions like this to turn to contemporary indigeneity. But I think the reason for that goes back to this idea of salvage tourism. Because if you're trying to salvage and pull together all of these scraps of Native history, it seems completely disconnected from contemporary Native people. Even though in those two shows, right, like Tecumseh Excluded, you have Native people playing these characters. And so it's just, it's one of those things where I can keep trying to find different answers and justifications and things like that. And I tried to write about it in the book, but it's really thought provoking. And like I said, I am not, I'm in no place to pass judgment. I can offer perhaps some constructive interpretations of it, right? Using my historical skills, but yeah, it's just, they're productions that are just something else to see.
I know I'm struggling with like I almost if they're offensive, I don't want to support them, but at the same time, I'm so intrigued after reading the book that I want to go out and see one just to really get the context behind it. But so it's just such a complex topic. I mean, clearly. However, moving on from this topic, we don't have much time left, but I did want to ask you one more question, which is I heard somewhere from no particular source that you are writing and working on writing a new book. If you would like to tell us a little bit about that.
So the next book, it seems like it's a complete 180 from this first book, but I promise there's a connection. I'm looking at activism, environmentalism, and tourism on and around my own reservation, which is the Red Cliff Reservation in northern Wisconsin. And my first book started because my mom and I went back to Bayfield, which is the little town next to Red Cliff, for the Apple Fest. Speaking of tourism, it's this festival that they've held every year since the 60s. And I found this little book that was called The Apostle Islands or Indian Pageant Cookbook. And I took it off the shelf and I'm flipping through it. And apparently, some people staged an Indian pageant on our reservation in the 1920s. And I looked at my mom and I was like, did you never tell me about this? Like, you know what I'm interested in? Like, this kind of seems perfect. And she was like, I have never heard of this in my entire life. And so that was quite honestly how I found out about Indian pageants in the first place. And I set the research on that production aside because it didn't fit with these other three, because the one on our reservation was only staged for a couple years. And so kind of set that aside. And then the other piece of it is that when I was writing my dissertation, my uncle sent me a bunch of newspaper clippings, a couple pages of like congressional testimony. And it was testimony that my grandma had given in the late 1960s about Red Cliff's desire to have their lands excluded from what is now the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. And again, I thanked my uncle, I set it aside, but it was kind of like always there. Like I knew it was there. And a couple years later, I started working on an article that looked more deeply at that event and actually found testimony from not only my grandma, but two of her sisters-in-law, and then the sister of one of her sisters-in-law. And so it was just really incredible to find these women's voices in the record and start to get a chance to really think, what does activism look like? What does, advocacy look like? What does tourism look like in this region and things like that? And so it is very much still a work in progress, but and like I said when we talked about this before, I love my first book. I'm very proud of it. I'm glad I wrote it. That felt like the book I had to write, and now this book feels like the book I get to write, especially because the research for this first book took me much farther away than I thought it would, and so this new book kind of feels like it's a chance to go home.
Yeah, thank you so much for telling us. I'm definitely looking forward to it. Take all the time you need. Right, writing and researching is a very lengthy process, but it is one that is well worth the while. So,
Hmm.
unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. So, thank you so much to our audience for joining us. If you would like to get your own copy of Staging Indigeneity, Salvage Tourism, and the Performance of Native American History, please visit bookshop.org to support independent booksellers. So, thank you, Dr. Phillips, for telling us more about your work, and thank you again to our audience for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Claire. I really appreciate it.